everybody, welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Zach.
And I'm Seth.
And we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
That's right, we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
We are the Classic Gaming Brothers. Gaming and classic.
Classic Gaming and Brothers.
Sometimes classic, always classy. No, always classic, sometimes classy.
Always classic, sometimes classy.
So, what have you been up? Oh, sorry. I was just about to ask you how you're doing, but I got this stack of papers from Doug. Producer Doug said, I do not like all these lore episodes you've been doing. You should do something about. So he's either said handheld shooters or banana bread.
Let's do handheld shooters.
I'm not sure how many video games are about banana bread, so that's a good one. There are probably games that are handheld shooters, right?
Yeah, a few.
Well, before we get into that, why don't you ask me what I've been recently playing?
Seth, what have you been recently playing?
Wow, thanks for asking.
You're welcome.
I guess I did say thanks.
You literally said thanks.
I know. Anyway, recently I've been playing Fallout. But not just any Fallout. I've been playing Fallout. Period. That's it. That's the game that I've been playing. No other numbers after it.
Nice.
Fallout was released back in 1997 and developed and published by Interplay. I'm playing a ridiculous min-maxed survivor where I have, 2 charisma, but 9 agility and 9 intelligence and 7 luck, and I'm just very good at shooting people, but the character's not very charismatic. He's also pretty dexterous, but he's not very strong or very, he doesn't like getting hit. But the character's also gifted, because apparently in Fallout 1, gifted is the most broken perk ever. What it does is it gives you a bunch of extra special stats and decreases your ability to gain XP by 5% or something stupid, which ultimately, not that big of a deal. So instead of earning 300 XP for talking to somebody, you get 250. But don't forget, you got a pile of extra spats. So you can have 9s and almost 3 or 4 skills. It's great. I love it. So I'm actually, though, playing a special version of the original Fallout. I'm playing a mod called Fallout Et 2. So Fallout Et 2 is a mod that brings the entirety of Fallout 1 into the Fallout 2 engine, which is very good for the quality of life improvements that they introduced from Fallout 1 to Fallout 2. Like, if you get stuck behind somebody, you can push them. In Fallout 1, without being in Fallout 2 engine, you can't push them, so good luck. However, because I min-maxed my character, I think I can only get 1 companion until I get my charisma up, because in Fallout 2, technically it's leadership divided by charisma or some weird number thingy that's based on charisma to determine how many followers you have, which is fine. But my character was sent out of Vault 13 by the Overseer to find the water chip because of a shipping error when Vault 13 was originally set up. And I have made my way out of the starting area where it's a vault door that you can't go back in and a cave full of rats. And I've left that area and I've made my way to Shady Sands, where nothing ever bad will ever happen there.
Never.
Ever. I'm really looking forward to playing this game. I talked to some initial people in the Shady Sands, picking up some XP, and then I'm going to be moving on out to go to Vault 8, I think, or 13, 15, or some other vault. I think it's 15 that's nearby. But anyway, so the original Fallout, really good time. I was actually playing it on my regular computer. I don't know how it would work on the Steam Deck. I imagine I still would need a mouse and keyboard to play it, or at least a mouse. But I was just on my computer playing the original Fallout, which was fun. Zach.
Yes, Seth.
What games have you been playing?
Seth, recently I've been playing Duranko Wonko. Duranko Wonko is a game that was released in March of 2024 for free on Steam, and it was developed by Bandai Namco. In the game, you play as a Pomeranian puppy who's left unsupervised while your owner takes a nap. Your job is to destroy the house. To do so, you must first spread mud all over the house, but soon you lose that mud, so you gotta find other things to make a mess out of, which includes wine, paint, anything you could think of. You're just making a mess of the house. You're knocking things over, you're breaking things, you're getting things messy. It kind of reminds me a lot of Catastrophe, that game where you play as a cat, but instead of batting things off of high places as a cat would, you are getting mud all over you or paint all over you and then shaking it off as a dog would. And yeah, the goals of the game is to rank up the highest bill possible that you could in terms of damage. The game has kind of a goofy aesthetic to it in the sense that, you start off as this dog covered in mud, but by the end of the game, you have like a chain gun that shoots paint at things. It's just wild. It's a fun game, and it's pretty short. It took me only about 45 minutes or so to play it, though there's kind of a replayability aspect. When you beat the game, you unlock everything in terms of like items, so you could come back and revisit the game and see if you can perfect your score, do it faster, etc. You do have to get certain areas like painted basically or super messy, and that kind of leads to maybe a replayability, see how fast you can get those places to be as messy as possible. But as mentioned, it is free on Steam. It is not something that is like temporarily free, it seems. It's a game that Bandai Namco just put out and said, this is free, have at it. And they actually put out a couple of games that are free at the same time. So they released 3 games. This is one of them, so I'm sure you'll be hearing me talk about one of the other games they put out in the near future. Just as a quick note though, if you do decide that you want to play Duranko Wanko yourself, bear in mind that when you start the game, it is entirely in Japanese. You can switch it to English, but it took me a while to figure out how to do this because I can't read Japanese, so I couldn't find the settings option. So you might want to like pull up a Google Translate app on your phone and maybe like scan your screen. That's one way to do it, or just click around until things suddenly turn to English. That's another way to do it. But that is just one negative point of the game, though I think people have written out the instructions on how to set it into English if you can't read Japanese on the Steam comments section. But anyway, that's Duranko Ranko. It's a fun little game. I recommend it. Today, though, we're not going to be talking about fun little games where you play as puppies or Fallout. We're going to be talking about the thing that our producer wants us to talk about, and that, of course, is handheld shooters. We've previously covered a lot of different first-person shooters. We've talked about Catacombs 3D. We've talked about Doom.
When did we talk about Catacombs 3D?
Maybe we haven't talked about Catacombs 3D, but anyway,
We've talked about Zero Tolerance?
We have. We talked about Zero Tolerance during our Doom episode, Doom Clones episode.
Oh, nice. I was asleep during that.
Yeah, and we also talked about Halo. So we've covered a lot of, PC first-person shooters. We've talked about console first-person shooters. But some shooters make their way onto consoles that you don't quite expect, those being handhelds.
Except Doom. You expect Doom on all things.
That's true. Doom is on everything. Really, I think a first-person shooter isn't necessarily the first game you'd expect to come to a handheld because for a while, handhelds weren't necessarily powerful enough. And when you think first-person shooters, you either think PC or console. They're most of the time designed to work on those systems. Games like Doom really play well when you have a mouse and keyboard, or games like Halo play really well when you have a controller. And a handheld arguably is just a controller, but it's also not, as in like older handhelds are very basic and they don't have like analog sticks and such. But there are quite a few first-person shooters on handhelds. And one of the earliest ones that have came out for the handheld was a game called Faceball 2000. Faceball 2000 is actually a port of a game called MIDI Maze for the Atari ST. The game, MIDI Maze, was ported to not just handhelds, but it was also ported to other systems. But specifically, it was ported to the Game Boy, the Game Gear, and the Super Nintendo. MIDI Maze was developed by Xanth Software FX in 1987 for the Atari ST, and it's a fairly unique game, especially for the time, because it was primarily designed to be networked. The game's name, MIDI Maze, comes from the fact that you could use the MIDI ports on your Atari ST to LAN network connect your Atari ST to another Atari ST, and you could do this up to 16 different Atari STs to create what is essentially a LAN network of MIDI Maze. And this is also in 1987, before LAN parties were a thing.
Yeah. It would also create a tripping hazard as you connect 16 computers together. And these aren't 16 small computers, no.
These are Atari STs, which are, full-sized PCs. But at the same time, it's kind of this novel idea. 1987, you're linking all these computers together to play a shooter. And this is before the era of Doom. This is before Quake. This is before Deathmatch. This is really before the concept of a LAN party even was a thing. So, back in the late 80s, people were bringing their Atari STs over to each other's houses and linking them up to play MIDI Maze, I assume.
So the game is pretty much straightforward. Picture this. You're in the Windows screensaver that looks like a maze. And as you turn a corner, there it is, a giant floating sphere. And that sphere is the Walmart smiley face. And you get to shoot it because you are also a giant floating Walmart smiley face floating through the old Windows screensaver that looks like a maze. You're like in that, except there's no bricks and it's just gray walls, and the gray walls are stalked by Walmart smiley faces, and you get to shoot them, which I always appreciate, shooting Walmart smiley faces. Now, at the beginning of the game, a computer sets the rules, divides the players into different teams, determines the maps, and then the game begins. And in the Atari ST version, you could also build your own maze. Oh, that's why it's called Faceball, because they're faces and they're shooting balls. Now, the Game Boy version, developed by Xanth and published by Bulletproof Software in 1991, took the idea to a different level. Instead of making a convoluted nest of wires with your Atari STs, you could just play it portably on your Game Boy, and you can use your link cable to connect two different Game Boys together to battle each other in the game. You could also get a 4-player adapter, and you could increase the game to 4 players, all playing the same game of shooting smiley faces. According to the game's programmer, Robert Champagne, they actually programmed the Game Boy version to allow up to 16 players. But Nintendo didn't want to make a special adapter for a game where you're floating around in a maze shooting smiley faces, which, frankly, I don't blame Nintendo for not doing that. Theoretically, you could daisy chain a series of adapters together, because if, say, you have a 4-player adapter, right? That means you can plug into 4 Game Boys, or you can plug into another possibly 4-player adapter. I don't know how.
Yeah, so you have to do it, from my understanding, you have to do it specifically with the Game Boy Advance adapters.
So if you find some Game Boy Advance adapters, you could attempt to get 16 players. Don't worry, it's 2024. People have already attempted this to varying degrees of success. Derek Alexander, aka Stop Skeletons from Fighting on YouTube, posted a photo back in April of 2024, just last month, of a 16-player Faceball 2000 game that was done at Midwest Gaming Classic, which Zach and I almost went to.
Yeah, so we could have participated.
We could have participated, or at least saw from a distance and did not approach whatever chaos was going on over there. This attempt required a custom-made adapter and a whole mess of GameCubes with Game Boy adapters. So if you really love Faceball like our producer does, he dreams of it and shooting smiley faces, mostly because he feels like he likes to stalk hallways, bringing terror to those who have dared to smile, then yeah, you can figure it out. It just, you have to dedicate a good portion of your life trying to figure it out.
Now, the Game Gear version of Faceball 2000 is a little bit different in the sense that it is identical to the Game Boy version, but it's in color. From what I've heard and can tell, it's legitimately just the exact same game code. They just added color. The Game Gear version, though, does appear to run a bit faster than the Game Boy version, but I think the colors make the game look worse. You might be asking yourself, well, Zach, how can a game now in color look worse than the game that's not in color? Let me tell you, the Game Boy does some creative things when you don't have color, and that is use gradients. And let me tell you what the Game Gear version doesn't use: gradients. It looks bad, in my opinion. I think the Game Boy version looks way better, despite the fact that it was limited to monochrome. Now, a version of the game was also released on both the Super Nintendo and the PC Engine, but who cares about those? Because we're only talking about handheld titles in this episode. So, moving on to another game. In the next year, 1992, another first-person game would be released for the original Game Boy. This game would be X by Argonaut Software, who we previously talked about in our Star Fox episode. X is a first-person space simulator where you play as a spaceship completing various missions to protect a planet called Tetemus 2. X is kind of neat, not necessarily in the sense that it's a space shooter, but in the sense that it's a space shooter, like first-person space shooter on the Game Boy. It was developed by Dylan Cuthbert of Argonaut Software after his boss, Jez San, saw a Game Boy at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991. San commissioned Cuthbert to develop a 3D engine for the console with the idea of looking into potentially making a game, and make a game he did, which was X. To do this, however, Cuthbert would have to reverse engineer the Game Boy itself because Nintendo was very selective of who they gave development kits to. To reverse engineer the Game Boy, Cuthbert had to set up a Game Boy that was being disassembled while a copy of Tetris was inserted and connected into the game, and that Game Boy's board was connected to a different board that Argonaut put together, and basically they just like took things apart while the game played and then saw what happened and recorded what was happening. From there, they were able to determine how exactly the games functioned and how the system functioned, and Cuthbert was able to get to work developing this 3D engine. He based his engine off of actually a game that Argonaut had previously released for various PCs called Star Glider 2, which is also a first-person space shooter. X was released only in Japan, and there was a planned American version called Lunar Chase that was in the works, but was canceled as Nintendo of America thought the game was just far too complex. They were like, this game's not a game that kids would like. So they canceled the English version. However, the English version is available to be played as a ROM because it was discovered in the Giga Leak, which is a massive data breach of Nintendo assets that's been going on since 2018. And so a ROM of the English version of X called Lunar Chase was found in the Giga Leak, and people have got it to work and you can play it. There was also a few other first-person adventure games for the Game Boy, like a game called Mysterium, but I'm not going to consider this for the list, partially because in Mysterium, it's really only like single screens you're looking at that look 3D. It's kind of more like playing a dungeon crawler where everything kind of looks 3D, but nothing's actually moving. Everything's just like, it's like looking at a PowerPoint presentation, and that's what dungeon crawlers mostly look like, and that's what Mysterium looks like, so I don't count Mysterium. Faceball 2000 and X have smooth, pretty much 3D movement, while a game like Mysterium is like one screen at a time.
The next game that we're going to talk about is Tyrannosaurus Tex, which would be the only 3D FPS game to be released for the Game Boy Color, but it would go on to be released in 2018. The game was developed much earlier than 2018, being originally planned to be released in March of 2000 before it would go on to be canceled, being developed by Slytherin Software and with a plan to be published by Eidos. In 2016, Pike would pick up the distribution rights and the game would be released. Tyrannosaurus Tex is very much what you would expect from an FPS playing almost like Wolfenstein 3D, but on a Game Boy Color. The game will be very limited in terms of graphics and colors, largely due to being on a Game Boy Color, but still plays very smoothly. In the game, you play as Tex, who's a cowboy from the town of Eastwood, who goes into a newly discovered diamond mine and finds robots and dinosaurs, which is what I would want to find in a diamond mine and not diamonds. Be like, I'm going to go into this diamond mine. Now, I have a question, Zach. Did you play a little bit of Tyrannosaurus Tex?
Yeah, a little bit.
Did you get to the part where he went into the diamond mine?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the beginning.
Did he go in by himself?
Yeah.
With any mining equipment?
No, he's got pistols.
Why did he go into the diamond mine with just pistols?
His name's Tex, why not?
Anyway, Tyrannosaurus Tex actually has a pretty wild development history beyond the story of a cowboy going into a mine and finding robots and dinosaurs, which also kind of sounds like Fallout. Tyrannosaurus Tex's development history was covered by NintendoPlayer.com and also was touched upon a bit in the video by Stop Skeletons from Fighting about Tyrannosaurus Tex. The game was primarily being developed by Ben John, who previously worked for Psygnosis. Ben John, per the article in Nintendo Player, was very into Game Boys. Apparently had all the Tetris blocks tattooed on his chest. And that's how much he loved Game Boy, or at least Tetris. He wanted to find a way to develop a game that would push the Game Boy Color to its limits, and planned to develop a game engine that could do just that.
Now, while demonstrating a tech demo at the European trade show that he helped develop with his father Mike and artist friend Dan Crowley, Ben John would meet Eidos representatives who were impressed by the demo. So impressed that they offered to form a partnership with Ben and his team to create a game, with Ian McNeil, an employee at Eidos, being assigned to the project by Eidos as a producer. Ian was actually very impressed by what Ben John and his team were putting together. His team of his dad and this guy Dan. He was so impressed by the work that they were putting together that Ian quit Eidos and decided to help form this new company, Slytherin Software. Eidos, still having a contract with Slytherin Software, began to promote the game, which they were calling Tyrannosaurus Tex, officially announcing it in January of 2000. Artwork would be mocked up for the game, featuring dual Colt pistols firing at a dinosaur in a maze. It's very cool looking artwork. It's just these pistols shooting a dinosaur in this like maze setting, and I think there's a robot in the background. The game would also be teased in various magazines, such as various lists of upcoming games put out by the publication Nintendo Power. There was hype for the game, but it was being slightly overshadowed by the looming threat that was the Game Boy Advance, which will come up later in this episode because we're not done yet. Slytherin needed to act fast, largely to keep interest in the game against the threat of the GBA, and so they began to release a free bi-weekly comic called The Adventures of Tyrannosaurus Tex, which featured a backstory for the character and the settings of the game. Slytherin would then hold a contest to let fans submit their own stories and story ideas, and the winners would receive sketches of the characters from the game.
So sadly, Slytherin would announce that Eidos was no longer publishing the game on December 26, 2000. They put out an announcement that they did not have a publisher. Eidos reportedly had paid various advances, and the money got spent and debts ran high. Another issue is that the game would have required a 16 megabit cartridge on the Game Boy, which no publisher wanted to take a risk on it, as it was not a recognizable IP, and the Game Boy Advance was coming out. And 16 megabit cartridges, we talked with Barry about this type of situation where they build out various different cartridges, and there is more cost for bigger cartridges, and there's like MOQs. So at the time when like Nintendo was creating Game Boy cartridges, I assumed that they would still have like a 5,000 minimum order quantity at 16 megabits, and nobody was like, we're not going to sell dick. No one wanted to do it. Take-Two would also turn them down. SCI would turn the game down. Telegames would turn down the game, and a petition would be started online to hopefully save the game. But then things kind of got odd. You see, Ian had a meeting planned with Ben to talk about the game and its future. When Ian got to the office after a 3-hour drive, Ben was missing. Just like Mario. As in, he was nowhere to be found and no one knew where he went. Ben's girlfriend informed Ian that Ben had fled the country and had no plans to return, and he stole the hard drive that contained the game's source code with him. Thankfully, this was not the only copy of the source code. However, the copy the team had was written in assembly, and it was written by Ben, who knew how he wrote in assembly. And assembly is a tough language to begin with and write in, let alone go back and try to read it, especially if it's not your code in assembly. Because remember, folks, assembly is the language that really communicates directly with the hardware of the device. Only Ben really knew what to do with it, and he was apparently going to Australia. Ian believed that Ben may have had a nervous breakdown and ran away due to the stress of the game. But to this day, no one is really sure what happened. The police and Interpol were contacted, and per Ian, a warrant is still out for his arrest if he ever returned to the UK. Ben's father, Mike, would also flee the country and disappear to Thailand. Yeah, so Ben, if you're out there and you're listening to this episode and you want to come on and talk about Tyrannosaurus Tex, well, yeah, we'll listen.
Now, a prototype version of the game was discovered, preserved, and finished. So essentially, a prototype version of the game that was flashed onto a cartridge was just found, and someone was able to dump it. And sometimes with flashed versions of prototypes, they don't work right away, so they had to do some fiddling around to get it to work. Eventually, it did start to work. And then when Pico acquired the rights to publish the game back in 2016, the game would be finished. So despite all the chaos around its history, you can play Tyrannosaurus Tex if you would like to. It is playable, and it's pretty decent. It's not amazing, but it shows that a lot of work went into the game. A lot lot of the work was done solely by Ben. So despite, Ben now being off wherever he is, he put a lot of good work into the game, and I hope he knows that. As people who were working on Tyrannosaurus Tex feared, the GBA did arrive in 2001, and so did a whole new potential for first-person shooters that you could take on the go. The GBA is a powerful system, being a 32-bit console, meaning its capabilities in the world of 3D were far greater than the Game Boy Color, and there are a handful of FPS games that were put out for the GBA, with at least 13 being released that are like traditional first-person shooters. There are first-person games also released for the GBA, but I wouldn't call those shooters. They're like rail shooters, which I don't really count for first-person shooters. On the GBA, both Doom and Doom 2 would be ported, though some significant changes were made. For one thing, Doom and Doom 2 were released as rated T for teens, as opposed to rated M for mature, meaning that blood and a lot of the satanic references had to get removed, which is not great if you are a fan of Doom and you're a fan of the blood and the satanic references, but you know what? They're still playable, and they're actually some pretty good ports of the game. A direct port of Wolfenstein 3D would also be released, and by direct port of Wolfenstein 3D, I mean this is a port of the DOS version of Wolfenstein 3D to the Game Boy Advance, and the reason I'm distinguishing that is because all other ports of Wolfenstein 3D that were made at that time, those were based on the Jaguar version of the game. So the Jaguar version of the game plays differently than the DOS version of the game and has some different abilities. This is a port of the DOS version. However, it's bad, and it's also one of the worst versions of Wolfenstein 3D ever. It has no music, it has bad frame rate, and the controls don't make sense. Like, they just are poorly mapped, and it's a hard game to play. However, for all the problems that it has, it's still impressive because only 2 people apparently worked on that game.
I feel like the way that it was ported, they just opened up a command prompt on the GBA and clicked install Wolfenstein.
That's how it feels, yeah. And then they accidentally set music to off.
And the Game Boy was like, this is not a DOS, like this is not a computer, this is not going to work. And they said, don't worry. They said, yes, I understand.
Now, another game that would be put onto the GBA is Duke Nukem Advance, which, as you can imagine, is a version of Duke Nukem 3D, though this has an original story and some original graphics. And also, because it was on a Nintendo console, they had to get rid of the nudity and the references to when Duke Nukem goes to porn stores. The plot of Duke Nukem Advance involves Duke being asked to investigate Area 51 after reports of aliens infiltrating the base. You fight some aliens, you get teleported to Egypt, you explore Egypt, then you travel to Sydney, and of course, you visit a nightclub. So it's all the things you'd expect Duke Nukem to do, except for being able to tip exotic dancers.
Oddly enough, one of the more better received GBA first-person shooters would be related to one of the worst movies ever made. X vs. Server was a 2001 shooter developed by Crawfish Interactive and based on an early script for the 2002 film Ballistic X vs. Server. The movie, for a fun fact, is one of the few films to earn 0% on Rotten Tomatoes, with 0 of the 119 reviews being positive. The game, however, X vs. Server, is actually pretty good. It's received a 9 out of 10 from IGN, a 4.5 out of 5 from GamePro, and a 7.1 out of 10 from GameSpot. And I was worried that I was going to go through this whole episode without reading numbers, followed by a name of a publication.
Well, I have to always include one reference to GameSpot in our episodes.
X vs. Server kind of plays like Doom, in that you explore a maze-like level and shoot bad guys. The game runs smoothly, and the graphics are designed to be clearly distinguishable, despite the limitations of the hardware. So what's fun about X vs. Server and Doom for the GBA is that they both have this aesthetic of early GBA games, where they're very bright when you play them on the console that is not the GBA, such as an emulator. This is because these games were made intentionally brighter to counteract the lack of backlight on the original model of the GBA. I can imagine they would also be exceptionally bright on like the Game Boy SP.
Oh yeah, no, they are. There's just this like era of first run GBA games though, that they were like, man, this light is awful on this system, like no one can see anything, let's make all of the textures incredibly bright. And the first Doom on the GBA, X vs. Server, as well as like Super Mario Advance, have this like aesthetic where just the colors are like oversaturated is the term. Everything's just oversaturated. And then like after the GBA SP came out, everything just goes back to normal. So like Doom 2 for the GBA looks normal. It doesn't have the weird aesthetic.
Now, as technology advanced, such as with the release of the DS and the PSP, so has the ability to play first-person shooters on the go. On the DS, Metro Prime Hunters brought the fun blasting and puzzle solving of Metroid Prime games to the portable format, and various versions of Call of Duty would get their release on both the DS and the PSP. Now that we have handheld consoles that can emulate pretty much everything, or are just a regular computer with like your examples like your Steam Deck or your Odin and all those guys. Yeah, any game can be played on the go. So like you could play whatever shooter you want. So all shooters can be a handheld, which specifically FPS shooters.
But I think that's a good summary of the history of handheld shooters. There are, of course, other fun ones out there. I mean, there's the oddities of the TI-83 ports of like Doom and Wolfenstein, which I don't consider ports. Those are just like versions of those games made. But in any case, there's plenty of options for you to play your first-person shooter game that you would want to play on the go. But nothing beats connecting up 16 Game Boy Advances and playing a little bit of Faceball 2000. Now, to get into our retro rewind, Seth had me play a game called Wiz and Liz. Wiz and Liz, stylized as Wiz, the letter N, Liz. And it has a subtitle of The Frantic Wabbit Rescue. This came out, and yes, it is Rabbit Rescue stylized with W's, so it's Wabbit Rescue. Now, the game came out in 1993 in the EU and was later brought to North American markets in 1994.
Sounds like a game that would come out in the EU first.
Yeah, it does. And it feels like it, too. It was developed by a company called Raising Hell Software and published by Psygnosis. It was released on the Amiga and the Sega Genesis, and I played the Genesis version. You play as either Wiz or Liz, who are wizards, and you have to go rescue some rabbits, or rather, wabbits. That's how they're stylized in the game. You have to rescue some wabbits.
So if everything that would have a regular word is switched with a W, are you playing as wizards, or are you playing as lizards?
No, you're playing as wizards. I think it's just anything that was an R, like an R word.
Or wizards.
No, you're like an old man with a pointy hat.
Are they both old men?
No, one's an old lady with a pointy hat.
Oh, that must be Liz.
That's Liz, yeah. And Wiz is the old man. Wiz the wizard. He also kind of runs like Sonic the Hedgehog. When you walk fast enough, his legs do the little spinny thing that like Sonic does.
Oh,
and when
yeah,
you jump, he goes into a ball. Though it's not like a Sonic game. It's more of a game where you have to like do a certain objective really quickly. So that's like find potion ingredients, such as like fruits, or rescue rabbits. Rescuing rabbits tends to be the main objective in most of the levels. And by rescuing them, you just kind of like run into them and they disappear. And then you collect letters, and when you collect enough letters, it forms a doorway, and it says the spell has been completed, and you go through the doorway. And that's pretty much the game. It's very fast-paced. The first level took me like 3 seconds. Nice. You just run through, you collect the letters, you're done. So it's one of those games that I think the intention is to basically just play as fast as you can. It's called a platformer. There is platforming, but I wouldn't call it necessarily like designed to be a platformer. It's more of just like run through this level, collect these objects. It's like a puzzle game in many ways, because you're trying to like figure out how to collect these objects the fastest way possible. It's fun. It's unique. I think it holds up. It's just one of those games where you just are racking up a score, so you can kind of like see how well you did and compare your time to other people's time. So it's a good game for that regard. Next week, Seth, I want you to play a game called Pugsy for the Sega Genesis.
Not Bugsy.
Not Bugsy, and not Bubsy. Pugsy.
Great. Now, Zach had me play Wolverine with the subtitle of Adamantine Rage, which was developed by Bit Studios and published by LJN. So we know where this ultimately is going to go. And by that I mean LGN generally makes crap. That was developed by Bit Studios for the SNES, and it was developed by Teeny Weeny Games on the Genesis, and they did this development back in 1994. This game has some of the most amazing cover art that's out there. It is a close-up of Wolverine's face, and his claws are out, and he looks like he's going to take a big bite either out of you or an apple. This game is also pretty tough, as you have one life with some health, and when you run out of health, you lose that life, you lose the game. And you have to get through 11 levels without doing that. However, you can stop and regenerate your life because Wolverine has regeneration ability. However, there's an invisible timer that you don't know about, and if you stop too long, you'll lose the game. Now, you also have to, in order to progress through a level, kill a number of enemies that the game doesn't tell you who to kill. There's just a counter at the bottom, And when you kill some enemies, the counter goes down. And when you kill other enemies, the counter doesn't do anything. And reminder, there's an invisible clock. Now, the major issue of this game, I feel like if what I'm about to describe didn't happen and it was just Wolverine and there was just the who knows how many enemies you need to kill and there was an invisible timer and all that jazz, it would have been an okay game for the time. It would have been just like another type of platformer with Wolverine on it. The issue with the game, though, is that the movement of Wolverine is not really well suited for the gameplay and also not really well mapped out when it comes to the controls. These type of games, these side-scrolling, like action platformer type games, tend to benefit when the characters' movements line up with the gameplay. When you try to I think it's like if you try to go up, he just dives forward or something. It's just bad. Take, for example, if you want to understand the frustration of this game, is to take a controller into your hand and then randomly assign buttons that control various different movements, such as kicking, backhanding, clawing, and just spread it out throughout the entire controller. And that's Wolverine. It's very tough to control Wolverine. The movements are just like he jumps and just hangs in the air for a while. It's just not good controlling. There are better games out there where if you want to play as Wolverine, but it is also not the Sega Genesis version of this game. Both the SNES and the Sega Genesis version of this game are bad. They do have some positive aspects to it, such as their soundtracks are fun, and Wolverine can climb on things, which is also fun. But do you know what other game has cool soundtracks and allows Wolverine to climb on things? X2 Clone Wars. And that's also on the Sega Genesis. And you could just play that game. And when you get to the option to pick your character, you could just pick Wolverine. And then you could just pretend it's a Wolverine game. And that's how I recommend if you play it. Does Wolverine Adamantine Rage hold up? No, not really. And by not really, I mean no. Now, next week, Zach, you could play X-Men The Madness in Murder World. I think it's actually just Madness in Murder World. But regardless, you can play that game. It's on the PC.
Great, I will. If you enjoyed this episode, you have any comments or questions about handheld video games, specifically handheld shooters, because that's what we talked about, you can email classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. We're available wherever podcasts can be found, be it iHeartRadio, Podbean, or iTunes. We are also available on Facebook, Classic Gaming Brothers, Instagram, Classic Gaming Brothers, X, CG Brothers Pod, Blue Sky, CG Brothers Pod. We're available on YouTube as Classic Gaming Brothers, and you can visit our website, www.classicgamingbrothers.com. Seth, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I've been Zach.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's
right.
That's right.